It was supposed to be the vacation of a lifetime. The cruise ship was luxurious, stretching out for miles on the open ocean. Families, couples, and solo travelers gathered for what was promised to be a week of sunshine, entertainment, and relaxation. But what began as a dream quickly turned into a nightmare. Everything started on the second day of the trip. The ship had been gliding smoothly through the waters, the endless horizon stretching out in every direction. Guests were lounging by the pool, sipping drinks, and chatting with each other as if there was nothing to fear. But then came the announcement. The captain had reported unusual activity in the ship's lower levels. It was vague, but unsettling. The crew assured everyone it was nothing to worry about and that the ship would continue on its course. The night that followed is when the terror truly began. Around midnight, the lights flickered. First, it was a few seconds of dimming and flickering, but then the entire ship went black. Complete darkness, the kind you feel in your bones. For a moment, no one knew what was happening, the stillness amplifying every sound. People whispered, panicked. Then the emergency lights kicked in, casting an eerie red glow across the ship. But the atmosphere had changed. The warmth and comfort of the cruise had turned into a suffocating, claustrophobic tension. Crew members scrambled in the hallways, their radios crackling with static, but their faces were tense, their movements hurried. The sense of something being very wrong was palpable. The most chilling part of the story came hours later, after the lights had returned to full brightness. A group of passengers, including a few children, had gathered in the ship's lounge to wait for any kind of explanation. As they sat, some of them noticed something strange. There was a low hum, almost like a vibration coming from somewhere deep within the ship. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, a deep, unsettling noise that seemed to vibrate in their chests. But what was worse was the growing realization that some of the crew had begun to act off. They were no longer the smiling, upbeat attendants they had been when the trip began. Their eyes were wide, unfocused, as if they were in a trance. They would pass by without speaking, their movements jerky and unnatural. One passenger tried to approach a crew member for help, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he simply stared at the person, his eyes blank. It was as if he didn't see them at all. The atmosphere was suffocating. Some of the passengers, now genuinely scared, tried to go back to their rooms, but many found their doors would not open. They banged on the doors, but no one answered. Even worse, when they checked the hallways, some of the crew members were now blocking the exits, standing still as statues, staring off into space. And then, just as quickly as the problem had begun, it stopped. The crew snapped out of their trance-like state and started moving again, business as usual. The strange humming ceased, the doors to the rooms opened, and things appeared to return to normal. But it wasn't. Not really. The following day, several passengers went missing. They had simply vanished without a trace. No one could explain it. No one had seen them leave their rooms or even walk down the hallways. It was as if they had never existed at all. And then there were the whispers among the crew. They spoke in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact with passengers. Some said the ship had a dark history, one that it carried with it like a curse. Some even claimed the ship had been built on a site of an old sunken vessel that had met its doom decades ago. No one knew the truth for certain. But what was undeniable was the growing sense of fear that gripped the remaining passengers. Every night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Strange shadows moved across the ship when no one was around, and sometimes passengers would swear they heard footsteps behind them when no one was there. The cruise ship eventually returned to port, but the passengers who had survived would never forget what happened. The ones who had gone missing were never found. The crew members who had acted strangely were never seen again. And the humming noise? Well, it never really went away. Some claim to hear it when they are on the water, somewhere far from shore, a haunting reminder of the terror that lurked beneath the surface. For those who were on board that ship, they all agreed on one thing. It wasn't just a ship, it was something else. Something that should never have been allowed to sail.
Story number 2.
The cruise ship had set sail under clear skies, promising a week of luxury on the open ocean. But what was supposed to be an idyllic vacation turned into a nightmare no one would ever forget. It began on the third night of the voyage. The ship was far from land, isolated in the vast expanse of the sea. A thick fog had rolled in, dense and oppressive, swallowing up the ship in a blanket of white. It was a fog that didn't dissipate, not for hours. The crew acted as if everything was normal, but passengers couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At first, it was subtle, a few odd occurrences here and there. Crew members who normally greeted guests with smiles and pleasantries began to look unsettled. They seemed distracted, even fearful. And then there were the sounds, the muffled voices, distant screams carried on the wind. They were soft at first, easily dismissed as the sounds of the ship groaning and creaking, but as the night wore on, they grew louder. One passenger, a woman in her mid-30s, reported hearing footsteps following her down a hallway. When she turned to confront whoever was behind her, no one was there. She checked her cabin. Nothing. The strange noise had stopped, but when she walked back down the same hallway, she saw something in the distance. At the far end of the corridor, a crew member stood, unmoving, staring at her. His face was pale, lips tight, eyes wide and unblinking. When she called out to him, he didn't respond. He simply stared, his gaze growing more intense as she moved closer. She reached out to touch his shoulder, and as her fingers brushed his skin, it was like touching ice. He was frozen, stiff as a statue. In that moment, her blood ran cold. She tried to scream, but nothing came out. Her legs felt like lead, paralyzed by terror. Just then, the fog thickened again, and when it cleared, the crew member was gone. She ran back to her room and locked the door behind her, but the unsettling feeling lingered. Over the following days, more and more passengers began to disappear. Some vanished from their rooms without a trace, others from the deck. The ship's crew maintained their usual routines, but their faces were drawn, their eyes haunted. The captain issued a statement that there was nothing to worry about, but the fear among the passengers only grew. Then, on the fifth night, the passengers who were still aboard began to hear it, the whispers. Not from the crew, but from the walls themselves. Soft murmurs, like voices drifting through the cracks of the cabin doors. Those who listened closely could make out words, though they couldn't quite understand them. But some said they were in an ancient language. Some of the passengers, desperate to know what was happening, began to search the ship, looking for any clue, any explanation for the strange occurrences. In the deepest part of the ship, they found a door that had been sealed off for decades, hidden behind a wall of storage. It had no key, no obvious way to open it. But there, at the bottom of the door, was a crack. A faint light glowed from underneath, and something scratched against the other side. When they finally forced the door open, the stench that hit them was overwhelming, an ancient, rotting odor, as if the very air itself had been decaying for years. They were greeted by a room full of old, tattered belongings, personal effects, clothing, photographs, and in the middle of the room stood a large, rusted metal object. It looked like an altar, stained dark and crusted with something that might have once been blood. But that wasn't the worst of it. From within the walls, something began to stir, a deep, guttural growl, like the sound of an animal in agony, emanated from the darkness. And then the walls themselves seemed to shift, creaking as if the very ship were alive. The passengers who had opened the door turned to run, but something grabbed them, long, skeletal hands reaching out from the shadows. Those who were unlucky enough to be touched by these hands didn't just vanish. They were pulled into the walls, their screams silenced as they were consumed by the ship itself. By morning, the ship was silent. The remaining passengers, too afraid to speak of what they had seen, were gone, having abandoned the vessel in fear. The crew, once fully aboard, was nowhere to be found. The ship returned to port, empty and abandoned. But what happened to the passengers who had disappeared, and what evil lurked beneath the surface of that cursed ship? The authorities never found out, but rumors still swirl. Some say the ship was haunted by an ancient entity, something that had been trapped below deck long ago. Others whisper that the ship itself was alive, feeding on the souls of those who dared to venture too far out to sea. And now the ship sits at the dock, still and silent, waiting for its next journey. It's said that if you listen closely enough, you can hear the faint whispers of the passengers who never made it home. And sometimes Just sometimes, you might see a shadow moving in the fog, watching, waiting to claim its next victim.
Story number 3.
The cruise ship had been advertised as an exclusive 5-star experience. Everything about it seemed perfect. Luxurious suites, exotic destinations, gourmet food, and entertainment designed to pamper the most discerning guests. But beneath the polished exterior of that ship, something darker was lurking. It began on the very first night, as the ship sailed away from the dock and out into the open ocean. The passengers settled in, excited for the days ahead, but something felt off. The air was thick with humidity, and the sea around them seemed unnaturally calm. No one could explain it, but the sky was a deep, unnatural shade of purple as the sun began to set, casting eerie shadows on the deck. At dinner, the atmosphere was jovial, everyone laughing and enjoying their meals. That's when one of the passengers, a man in his late 40s, stood up to excuse himself from the table. He hadn't been feeling well, claiming his stomach had been bothering him. He staggered off toward the restroom. No one thought much of it, until he never returned. Hours passed. The crew searched the bathrooms, the decks, even the engine rooms, but there was no sign of the man. At first, it was assumed that he had simply gone overboard, but the crew couldn't find any evidence of it. No splashes, no signs of distress. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. They told the passengers to go about their evening, though a subtle tension lingered in the air. That night, strange things started to happen. A few passengers reported hearing faint banging noises coming from the lower decks. Some said it sounded like someone was pounding against the walls. Others claimed to hear muffled voices echoing through the halls. But no one dared to investigate. The ship's atmosphere felt wrong, heavy, as though it was closing in on them. The next morning, the ship's crew were quieter than usual. The missing man had not been found. In fact, the crew had stopped mentioning him at all. They went about their tasks, but their eyes were wide, their movements sharp, like they were on edge. Some passengers started to whisper about the strange noises they had heard the night before, but when they brought it up, the crew simply brushed them off with nervous smiles. But as the days wore on, the whispers grew louder. More passengers reported seeing strange shadows darting across the hallways, out of the corner of their eyes. Sometimes the lights in their cabins would flicker, then go out entirely. A few even claimed to have seen figures standing at the end of their hallways, cloaked in darkness, their faces obscured. On the 4th day of the cruise, a couple went missing. They had retired to their cabin for the night, and when the morning came, they were gone. The cabin was locked from the inside, with no sign of forced entry. The crew was beginning to look desperate now. They could not explain what was happening, but they knew something was terribly wrong. It was on the 5th night that things took a darker turn. Passengers began to report strange dreams, vivid and disturbing. One woman dreamt of being trapped in the ship's lower levels, unable to find her way out, while the walls seemed to close in on her. Another passenger dreamt that the sea had turned black and the ship was slowly sinking, dragged down by unseen hands. But the worst was yet to come. Around midnight, a loud bang echoed throughout the ship. It came from below deck, followed by what sounded like a human scream. The passengers rushed to the windows, staring out into the inky blackness of the ocean, but there was nothing to be seen. The scream echoed again, more desperate this time, followed by another bang, and then silence. In the chaos that followed, crew members scrambled, locking down parts of the ship, herding passengers toward the upper decks. Fear was palpable. A handful of the ship's crew began to shout orders, but their voices were panicked, trembling. They warned the passengers to stay away from the lower levels. But someone brave or foolish, decided to investigate. A small group of passengers, their faces filled with a mix of terror and curiosity, made their way to the lower levels of the ship, where the screaming had originated. The hallways were eerily quiet now, except for a soft creaking sound from deep within the ship. As they ventured deeper, they stumbled upon something horrific. A door, slightly ajar, with bloodstains streaking the floor beneath it. They opened it, their hearts pounding in their chests. Inside the room, they found a scene that would haunt them forever. The missing man, his body was sprawled out, twisted in unnatural angles. His eyes were wide open, frozen in fear. But it wasn't the man's body that terrified them most. It was what stood beside him. A tall, gaunt figure draped in shadows, its face obscured by a veil of blackness. It was tall, impossibly tall, and seemed to sway as if it were part of the very ship itself. It was silent, but there was something in the way it moved that suggested it had been waiting for them. One of the passengers screamed, and the figure turned its head, its eyes glowing red. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from its chest, and with one swift motion, it lunged at them. The group scattered in terror, racing back through the dark hallways, their footsteps echoing. The figure, though, wasn't far behind. It moved too quickly, too fluidly, and before long, it had caught up with them. Those who were closest to it were dragged into the darkness, their screams muffled as if swallowed by the ship itself. By the time the others made it back to the deck, they were breathless, their faces ashen with terror. The ship's crew had locked all exits, but it was already too late. The figure had followed them, no longer hidden in the shadows. It was right there, standing on the deck, towering over the frightened passengers. And then, as if it had never been there, it vanished, leaving nothing behind but the remnants of those who had seen it, those who had not returned. The ship made its way back to port, but no one spoke of what had happened. The few passengers who survived were forever changed. Some went mad, raving about shadows that moved and eyes that watched them from the walls. Others simply disappeared, unable to escape the haunting memories. And the ship, it was never seen again. Some say it still sails the open waters, carrying the curse of its passengers with it. Others claim to hear the sounds of screaming in the distance, carried on the wind. If you listen closely enough, you might even hear the faintest whispers, calling you to join them in the depths.
Story number 4.
The ship had always been known for its reputation, a luxury liner that catered to the wealthy and the adventurous alike. They said it was built for those who sought thrills, but it was the stories that surrounded the ship that made people nervous. Of course, no one ever spoke of them openly, but the rumors were enough to make even the most seasoned sailors uneasy. It was on the 8th night of a 10-day cruise, when the passengers were far from any known land, that the unthinkable happened. The weather had been perfect, the sea calm, and everyone was enjoying their time on board. But when the ship's clock struck midnight, everything changed. The first sign of trouble came when the ship's engines cut out. It wasn't the usual mechanical failure. There was no warning, no sputtering or shuddering. The engines just stopped. The ship drifted for a few moments, and in that eerie silence, people started to murmur. Crew members scrambled, but no one could explain what had happened. After a few minutes, the engines roared back to life, and the ship started moving again. But something was different. The crew began receiving strange reports. Passengers claimed to have seen lights flickering in the distance, flashing in odd patterns on the horizon. Some said they heard voices, soft, hushed whispers that seemed to come from the walls, the air itself. It was dismissed at first as the effects of isolation, of being surrounded by nothing but endless ocean. But then the disappearances began. It was subtle at first. A man went missing from his cabin without a trace. His wife claimed she had gone to sleep beside him, but when she woke, the bed was cold and he was gone. The crew checked his cabin, the hallways, even the lower decks. Nothing. Not a sign of him anywhere. Then another passenger vanished, a woman this time. Her room was locked from the inside and no one had seen her leave. But when they opened the door, there was nothing at all, except for a strange, acrid smell, like something rotten, something decayed. The ship's captain gave the order to search the entire vessel, but there was no sign of the missing woman. By the 3rd day of strange disappearances, the atmosphere aboard the ship had turned dark. Passengers who hadn't gone missing spoke in hushed voices, afraid to go to their cabins alone. Crew members seemed to be everywhere, their faces tight with worry. And then came the most terrifying incident of all. A passenger, a man who had been walking along the upper deck late at night, swore he saw something in the distance, a figure standing on the edge of the ship, staring out into the sea. At first, he thought it was a crew member performing a routine check, but as he drew closer, he realized the figure wasn't moving. It was standing still, eerily still. The man called out to the figure, but there was no response. He approached cautiously, But as he neared, the figure suddenly turned and looked at him. It was a face, but not a face anyone could recognize. It was pale, too pale, and the eyes were wide open, unblinking. The mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, one that made the man's skin crawl. The figure didn't speak, didn't move. It simply stood there, staring at him with those empty, hollow eyes. The man tried to run, but as he turned to flee, he felt a cold hand grasp his shoulder. He spun around, but the figure was gone. His heart raced, and the only sound he could hear was the thundering of his own pulse in his ears. He fled down to the lower decks, telling anyone who would listen what he had seen. But no one believed him, and soon he vanished, just like the others. The passengers began to realize that something was deeply wrong, but by then it was too late. More people disappeared every night, vanishing without a trace. The ship seemed to be haunted, alive with a malevolent presence that had no explanation. The crew grew more secretive, locking themselves in their quarters and avoiding contact with passengers. And then, on the final night, the ship came to a sudden stop. It wasn't mechanical this time. The ship just halted, dead in the water. Panic spread among the remaining passengers as the realization hit them. The ship wasn't lost at sea. It had been pulled into something that none of them could understand. It was then that the fog appeared. At first, it was a small patch of mist on the horizon, but it grew quickly, creeping over the water, blanketing the ship. The air grew thick, suffocating, and every breath felt like it was pulling something dark into their lungs. The crew panicked. Some began to pray. Some ran to the lifeboats, but they found the lifeboats gone, vanished as if they had never been there at all. Then from within the fog came the sounds, soft whispers at first, just outside the range of hearing, but growing louder, more urgent. Screams, voices calling out in terror. And then the ship's lights flickered and died. Total darkness. In that darkness they came. They were like shadows, but they weren't. They were figures, human in shape but distorted. Their eyes black holes, their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. They moved soundlessly, gliding through the dark, reaching for the passengers who were still alive. Those who touched them were pulled into the shadows, their screams swallowed by the night. When the sun finally rose, the ship was gone. No trace of it remained, no wreckage, no sign of where it had been. The only evidence that it had ever existed were the few survivors who had been found, scattered across the shores of a nearby island. They were broken, their minds shattered. They spoke of the fog, the whispers, and the shadows that took them, but none of them could remember exactly what happened. They only knew one thing: the ship was cursed, and some say it still sails the waters, lost to time, drifting between worlds, its passengers lost to something far darker than the ocean itself. The unlucky ones who cross its path are pulled into the fog, never to be seen again. They say you can hear its eerie calls on the wind if you listen closely enough. And if you're too close to the water, you might just feel the chill of those cold, unseen hands reaching out for you.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be a short weekend getaway, a quiet cruise along the coast for a group of friends looking to relax. But from the moment they boarded, there was an eerie sense of foreboding hanging in the air. They couldn't explain it, but as they crossed the gangplank onto the ship, it felt as if they were entering a different world, one that didn't quite belong to the living. The first few days were typical, though slightly off. The ship was luxurious, with polished wood, gleaming railings, and endless buffets of food. But some passengers began noticing odd things. A woman in her early 20s swore she had seen the same elderly man sitting in the same chair for 2 days straight. He never moved, never ate, and just stared ahead with unblinking eyes, his hands folded neatly in his lap. At night, strange noises echoed through the lower decks, soft, scraping sounds that seemed to come from deep within the ship, like something or someone was dragging their feet along the metal floors. The crew seemed unfazed by it, continuing their duties as if nothing were out of the ordinary. But the passengers grew uneasy, especially when they realized that some of the crew members appeared to be avoiding certain parts of the ship. On the fourth night, things took a darker turn. The ship had been sailing under a thick fog, so dense that visibility beyond a few feet was impossible. The usual comforting sounds of the sea were gone, replaced by an unsettling silence, Broken only by the occasional distant thump or creak, the passengers were unsettled, but none of them had any idea that the worst was yet to come. Around midnight, one of the friends, a man named James, decided to take a late-night walk on the upper deck. The fog was so thick he couldn't see his hand in front of his face. As he walked the empty, shadowy deck, he thought he heard something, a faint whisper, like a voice calling his name from the mist. He stopped, straining to hear. The voice sounded familiar, but there was something wrong about it. He called out, "Hello?" but received no response. Suddenly, there was a shift in the fog, and something appeared, a figure standing at the far end of the deck, motionless, dressed in a long, flowing black coat. The figure was so still it looked like a shadow against the dense fog. James took a step forward, unsure if he should approach or turn back. But the figure moved before he could make a decision. It glided toward him, its feet barely touching the ground. The air grew cold, and the hair on James's neck stood up. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it continued to glide closer, its face hidden beneath the dark hood of its coat. When it was only a few feet away, James tried to take a step back, but the figure was too fast. It was right in front of him now, its cold breath hitting his face, yet he still couldn't make out its features. And then in the darkness, the voice spoke, "Join us." Before he could react, everything went black. James woke up hours later on the floor of his cabin. The ship's lights were flickering, and the fog outside had thickened even further. He was disoriented, his body stiff and his mind foggy. He had no idea how he had gotten back to his cabin, but one thing was clear: something was terribly wrong. When he stumbled out onto the deck again, he found that several other passengers had vanished without a trace. The ship's crew remained strangely silent, their faces pale as they worked. It was as though they were all hiding something, but no one dared to ask questions. By the next morning, things had gone from disturbing to terrifying. The fog didn't lift, and neither did the sense of dread. In the morning light, the remaining passengers were called into the ship's dining hall for an emergency meeting. The captain appeared, his face drawn tight with worry. "We've lost contact with the outside world," he said. "We are completely isolated, and some passengers are no longer with us." The group of friends who had boarded the ship together began to realize the full extent of the horror they were trapped in. One of them, Sarah, had been missing since the previous night. But she wasn't the only one. They learned that multiple passengers, including a young child and an elderly couple, had simply vanished from their rooms during the night. The crew continued to act as if everything was normal, though their eyes darted nervously, as if they knew more than they were saying. It wasn't until they made their way to the lower levels of the ship, seeking answers, that they discovered the truth. There, in the deepest part of the ship, was a hidden room, locked away, its door covered in rust. The group of friends managed to break through, and inside, they found a series of old photographs of past passengers who had gone missing on previous voyages. In every photograph, there was one common detail: a tall, hooded figure, standing in the background, watching. They also discovered some far more horrifying. The ship wasn't just a ship. It was a trap, built to lure people in, to trap them. Every few years, it sailed the same route, collecting more and more souls. The fog, the whispers, and the figure, everything was part of the ship's ritual. It was alive, feeding off the fear and the lives of those who boarded. And once you entered its grasp, there was no escape. In the days that followed, the friends began to realize they weren't alone. They could feel eyes watching them from the shadows. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, and they started to hear voices in their heads, urging them to join them in the dark corners of the ship. And the worst part? Some of the crew had started to disappear, leaving behind only their cold, lifeless uniforms. As the ship drifted further away from land, the friends understood that there would be no rescue, no help. They were trapped, caught in the endless cycle of the ship's curse. Some of them tried to escape, to swim to the nearest island, but the fog was too thick and the waters too treacherous. The ship had already claimed them. In the end, only a few of them remained, staring out into the endless fog, their minds breaking under the weight of what they knew. And as they stood there, they heard the soft scraping sound again, closer now, Something or someone was coming for them. They never saw the ship dock again, and when rescuers finally found the ship, abandoned, drifting aimlessly in the sea, there were no signs of the passengers or the crew, just the photographs left behind in that hidden room. No one speaks of it anymore. But some say that if you listen carefully, late at night, you can hear the whispers of those who are still trapped aboard. The ship, they say, is still out there, waiting for its next passengers. And if you ever find yourself on the water, drifting too far from shore, you might hear it call.